This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Hi, welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews, episode 61. We are getting going with a question from Sarah from Kuwait, who says, "What do you think about bringing animals back from extinction? Can we call it controlled evolution, or is it more like advanced preservation?"
Well, I think the near consensus in the field at this point is you can't call it either. So the words on everybody's lips this month, dire wolves. Dire wolves. The real dire wolves were a type of wolf, big, like as big as the biggest living wolves now, that lived in the Americas and went extinct about 10,000 years ago. And they're very exciting, and they're also extinct. And it got brought up that this whole approach of de-extinction, having some sort of extinct creature where you could extract DNA and use that as a basis for constructing, and that's going to be the very accurate word, constructing a version of that species now in the present, as termed de-extinction. And I would assume because, dire wolves and Game of Thrones were so trendy, they were done first. And the news a couple of weeks ago was this group, mostly led by this guy named George Church at Harvard, very accomplished scientist there, did a first de-extinction of a species of an extinct dire wolf. What they did was they made three dire wolf pups, and they gave them three charming names that I've now forgotten. And there's adorable pictures of them. And what's next? Let's do a mammoth next. Let's do a dodo bird next. So dire wolves is the first of this. So very exciting. What might not be that exciting? What is it they actually did? So they looked at the genome of extant current wolves and the genome of the dire wolf as extracted from fossils or preserved carcass or who knows what. And they identified the critical gene differences, what it is that differentiates a modern wolf from a dire wolf. And what they did was take a wolf genome and clip out those genes that were different and then put in synthetic versions of the dire wolf genes. So just as a minor thing here, they weren't actually putting in DNA from a dire wolf. They were putting in DNA that they had made to have the same sequence as that of a dire wolf. So good, they put that in. And so what does this give us now? Is the thing that pops out the other end, these three adorable pups, a dire wolf or what? And the consensus is it's not quite really a dire wolf. And I don't know if this is a perfectly apt metaphor, but suppose you decide you want to de-extinctionate some extinct car, a 1931 Studebaker, which I have no idea what they look like, but you want to bring them back from the dead. You want to make a new 1931 Studebaker. So what you do is you take, I don't know, a Prius and you rip off all the exoskeleton of it, the doors, the hood, all the things that you see when you look at this car, and you say, okay, well, let's fabricate what looks like the hood of the Studebaker, and we'll stick it on here. And oh, here's a good picture of what the back end of it looks. So let's make one of those, and we'll even make sure it's made out of the same types of metals. So we stick this on, and then we built ourselves some Studebaker doors and then stick a top. And what you have is something that looks like a Studebaker, but to stretch this metaphor a little bit further, is a Prius on the inside. So the question now is this a dire wolf? Have you brought this species back from extinction? And what everybody in the field says is, no, this is not a dire wolf. This is some sort of ersatz, sort of genetically messed around with approximation of what a dire wolf looks like, of what some of the key genetic differences are. So first off, this isn't really a species that was extinct, which now no longer is. No one's really claiming that. So the question becomes, what Sarah brought up is, so is this a good thing or a bad thing? Whoa, like de-extinct a dire wolf or a dodo or a Tasmanian striped tiger. What could be better than that? What it leads us to is some of the classic things that sort of hamstring people who are doing conservation, trying to save endangered species. And it generally comes up two problems that arise. The first one is the pull towards saving only the cool species, preventing the extinction of the ones that get cute responses in you and the adorable ones, and only save the species that you like looking at. And I think after the fires in Australia in recent years, koalas now are officially on the endangered list. And if you look at, oh my God, koalas may not make it. What about blobfish? They don't have a prayer of coming through. Look at a picture of a blobfish, and you'll see how much you would not want to save it from extinction. So the first problem for any realm of animal conservation is, ooh, the pull to just save the cool species. The second problem is the pull to save a species rather than the ecosystem in which they live. And if pandas were to go extinct, it doesn't matter how many of them you de-extincted if you don't have bamboo rainforests for them. The pull towards, ooh, let's make sure the species doesn't go extinct. And it's so much easier to conceptualize why you should send in a donation to save the panda bears than to save a whole bunch of bamboo trees. So we've got some similar challenges here now with the likes of a de-extincted direwolf. Okay, the first one, is there a problem that it's only going for the charismatic species, that they're not de-extincting some like hideous looking amphibian thing? No, that one's fine. If you want it to be something cool, it will be very cool to have a mammoth, even if it's a mammoth with a Prius inside of it. Like, yes, no one's going to complain if they do this to a charismatic species at the beginning rather than to like some slime mold thing. In terms of the habitat, that's a real problem because suppose you made yourself a whole bunch of mammoths, and where are you going to put them now? Because the tundra is melting and the tundra forests have been logged, and where are you going to put them? Do you have like an actual habitat, or are you doing this? Are you making this creature, causing it to come into existence? This weird hybrid chimera Prius direwolf or mammoth, and do you have a place for it to live other than in some enclosure in the research facility? So that's a big challenge. The biggest challenge that comes up when thinking about this tremendous danger, which is to say, whoa, look at that. We could bring a species back from extinction. Okay, it's not really a dire wolf, but it looks and it smells and it tastes like a dire wolf. It's good enough for us. We can do that. In other words, if you've got some species that's teetering on the edge of extinction, don't worry so much. If it goes extinct, heck, we can bring it back. If that brings in any sort of complacency, that will be a disaster. So that's definitely a drawback. That's not a very realistic drawback yet. Finding a habitat for these is going to be a challenge, but just on the sheer cool level of there's now walking around Earth three organisms that kind of look like something that disappeared from our planet 10,000 years ago, that's pretty cool. Don't get overly giddy about it.
Okay, now Krisha from the Philippines says, may we know your thoughts on parasocial relationships formed from the internet, TV, or in real life, and its connections to scarier stuff like stalking? And has there been a particular study on this subject matter that you've found interesting or compelling?
Parasocial relationships. Okay, broadly, when you feel as if you have formed a relationship with a movie character, with a celebrity, with a fictional whatever, where you are getting very, very intertwined in what's happening to them, and where there gets to be a little bit of squishiness about where you end and they start. Okay, so parasocial. So let's talk about a triumphant, shiny example of someone who is subject to lots of parasocial relationship stuff. Taylor Swift, unless you've been living under a rock, actually, probably even if you've lived under a rock, you will know she's one of the most important humans alive. And a year ago, when she was doing that tour all throughout the world, massive amounts of economies were being boosted. You had little Rust Belt towns that have been depressed since the Depression, and merely her showing up to give a concert and all of her Swifties following there built up the economy. She's incredible. She's one of the most important living humans. And thus, as a result, her guy, Travis Kelce, is one of the most important humans. And this spreads so far that like the kid who gets Gatorade for Travis Kelce in between plays and sprisses his face, the kid is just like signed a contract for his memoirs or something. Hugely celebrity dominating. So, what do we make of the intense parasocial relationship that lots of people have with her? Let me just start off to put my cards on the table. My own knowledge of Taylor Swift is very minimal. I know she has one gorgeous song that's in the credits of one of the Hunger Game movies. And there was some other song of hers that had something, somebody had sneakers and somebody had high heels, and somewhere along the way, I got the phrase shake it off, and I used it in a lecture. And either people were enthused by that or they were patronizing me very badly. Okay, so that's the sum of my knowledge about Taylor Swift. Lots of people, though, have been studying this Taylor Swift parasocial phenomenon. For example, back in the fall, there was an op-ed piece, there was an article in the New York Times from a New York psychiatrist. I'm forgetting her name at the moment, but as all good New York psychiatrists should be, there were hyphens in her name. And she was talking about how her clientele, adolescent girls, young women, their lives were all dominated by their feelings about Taylor Swift. And this was not the usual sort of fixation on a celebrity, a female rock musician, a female pop singer. What are they about? This sort of edgy extroversion and sort of this, I don't know, predatory sexuality. And that's not what Taylor Swift is about. What's everybody they're identifying with her? Um, she's had some tough times. She's had some tough times, and her fans know about it, and she's been remarkably open about it. And everyone by now thinks of her as their big sister, where she can effect say to them, you know what I've been through. Borrow my strength, lean on me, and you're going to be okay. That's a lot of expectations to project onto a celebrity. That's a lot of psychic space going into a relationship that doesn't really exist. And we are constantly showing that we have trouble telling the difference between an actor and their role, or a celebrity and our own relationship to them. For example, all sorts of TV and movie actors who've played doctors, they get stopped on the street where somebody wants to tell them about their medical problems. Somewhere in our heart of hearts, we are absolutely convinced that Emma Watson and Rupert Grint hooked up at some point, because look at how Hermione and Ron turned out. That had to be something that we think about these celebrities as if we are having to prepare. What if we have to actually interact with them? Will I be prepared? What if Chris Hemsworth burst into the room and says, "Run away with me"? What are you going to say to him? Or like, why you need to keep track of whether Jennifer Lopez and Ben Affleck are back together again or not? Because if you run into Jen at Target, you don't want to like make a faux pas, and we imagine they are intermingled with our lives. So you look at this and like, what does science have to tell us about this? We get some insight, of course, from animal behavior, zoology, evolution, anthropology. You look at other social primates, and they are voyeurs big time. All they spend their time on is keeping track of who's doing what to whom. And some very like elegant, beautiful studies, which I think we've talked about previously, will show your average baboon sitting in a troop understands what everybody else's rank is. The baboon doesn't just sit there and think of these are guys who can hassle me and these are guys who I can hassle. They understand rankings. They understand rankings in the context of families. They pay attention to it. If you play pre-recorded voices of like the number one baboon giving this dominant vocalization and number seven gives a subordinate vocalization, nobody looks up. Of course, if instead you hear number seven give a dominant vocalization and number one gives a groveling subordinate, everybody looks up because everybody knows that's not what our social landscape is about. Social primates paid a huge amount of attention to this. And this is one of the themes that's come through anthropologists studying hunter-gatherers. And now I'm required by law to say humans, hominins, have spent 99% of their history as mobile, nomadic hunter-gatherers. And anthropologists who study some of the remaining hunter-gatherers on Earth, what they all come back with is, what do they do when they're sitting around the fire at night? They gossip. They gossip about who's messing with who in the bushes, who shouldn't be. They gossip about who isn't sharing what they got in the hunt. They gossip about who didn't cover somebody's back at a scary point, and it is dominated by that. It is a very, very primate thing to want to be keeping track of social relations and what they may have to do with you and what the implications, what the significance is of that. So that's great. But now what happens is the way we live our lives, you stand online at a Starbucks and there are more strangers there than your average hunter-gatherer ever encountered in their lifetime. We are surrounded by strangers in our cities and our towns. We are anonymous. And we have this very deeply honed primate social brain. And before you know it, what does it mean for me? You're thinking, oh, Oprah Oprah is going to like me because she knows I've praised her charitable work. No, Oprah is going to like me more than she already likes me. We're just projecting these relationships onto people who don't know us and don't care. And if they did know us, they wouldn't care. Or maybe even they're fictional and they don't even, and we're looking for connectiveness there. Okay, so lots of people, probably most of us do that in sort of a normal range. But then you get people who get into what's termed pathological celebrity worship. And this has actually been studied. Psychologist named Lynn McCutcheon has studied this. There's these inventories, these questionnaires of how much do you know about this person, that person? How much time do you spend thinking about them, talking with other people about them? Are you spending more time doing that than you would like, but you're having trouble stopping? And what she showed was basically three types of people who get caught up in this parasocial celebrity obsession stuff. The first one is the most commonplace and the most benign, which is people who tend to be kind of extroverted and sensation seeking, and getting caught up in gawking stuff is just fun. They're very unneurotic. It's fun seeking. That's most people. The next group tend to be people who are socially isolated. And what they're looking for is not only an imaginary relationship with a celebrity, but they're looking for the online fan clubs. So they can all be talking at night about the heartbreak and the travails and the triumphs of whoever. It gets them a social community. These tend to be people prone towards mood disorders, people with a lot of neuroses, people with a lot of cognitive inflexibility. That's what comes through in the profile. But then we've got the third category. And these are the people who are completely intertwined with the lives of these individuals to a point where they become stalkers. They devote their life savings to buying sweatshirts with the person on it. They begin to indeed have trouble telling where they end and the next person, the celebrity, starts. Some ego boundary issues with that. Not surprisingly, a lot of these folks have some issues with tangential disordered thought, mild psychoses. And these are people where, like, the most prominent thing is when you force them to reflect on what they're doing, they're saying, oh my God, I should be spending less time and money on this, they say sensibly, and then they can't change. Okay, so that's a psychological perspective on the range of people falling into it. Naturally, me being a neurobiologist, I'm curious if the brain has anything to tell us about this. And it turns out it's really, really interesting what the brain indicates about us and our parasocial celebrity worship. Okay, so you look at the cortex, fancy part of the brain, it does fancy thinking for you. And there's more, how should I say, non-pejoratively, more simple parts of the cortex that do primary sensory processing. And what you have in there are neurons that are highly specialized. This neuron knows how to recognize this pixel of light, and the neuron next to it knows how to recognize the pixel next to it. And then above is a neuron that knows how to recognize a line of this length of this angle of light, and the one next to it. You have these neurons that are highly specialized in knowing, in effect, one thing and one thing only. As these were first getting sorted out in the 50s and 60s, what people were then assuming was, oh, just keep going higher and higher levels, and eventually you were going to find a single neuron way up at the most abstract associational parts of the cortex, a single neuron there that knows one thing and one thing only. It knows how to recognize the face of your grandmother. And right next to it was a neuron that would recognize the face of your other grandmother. And right next to it, and people sort of sardonically, snarkily in the field began to call these grandmother neurons. And there was a whole branch of neuroscientists who went looking for grandmother neurons, neurons that would be way up in cortical processing, where they would in effect know one thing and one thing only. And this was a very complex cognitive sensory something rather than a pixel of light or a single note on a flute or some such thing like that. And the massive disappointment for lots of these folks was people went looking and like grandmother neurons, it didn't work that way. And when people analyzed it, it made perfect sense that there weren't grandmother neurons because you don't have enough neurons in your brain to have all the fancy ones knowing only one thing only. And instead, this brought in a whole new world of overlapping networks of neurons, and that's how you get associations. But what people then began to figure out after the first generation of grandmother explorers had died out, disappointed, heartbroken, was that actually now and then you do find a grandmother neuron, a neuron that has a reaction to a single stimulus and a complex one. There's not many of them, and the term in the field now is sparse coding. So, what do these sparsely coded pseudo grandmother neurons code for? And this takes us to a 2005 study. And this was someone who was about to undergo some brain surgery, and they were going to remove part of the cortex. And what is standardly done is electrodes are put in, probing what the neurons in that area do so you can figure out how to take out the minimal amount of tissue. And what was being done, this was near part of the visual cortex projections into the associative cortex. And what they were doing was flashing up pictures of things to see like what would turn on these neurons. And they found a sparsely coded grandmother neuron that responded to one thing and one thing only. And what it responded to was Jennifer Aniston. It was a multi-talented Jennifer Aniston neuron. It responded to a picture of her, a cartoon, a caricature of her, a scene from Friends. It did not respond to Brad Pitt. It certainly did not respond to Angelina Jolie. Those of you who are not history majors, go look up what that triangle was about. This was a neuron way up on top that responded to the idea of Jennifer Aniston. Hearing somebody say her name, this was, and immediately people stopped calling these grandmother neurons, and since then they've called them Jennifer Aniston neurons. So the point being, there's not many of them. And it turns out, for whatever reasons, and that's a whole interesting separate story, our brain does not have a whole lot of these specialized, highly specialized, know one thing and one thing only, cortical neurons way up there. There's not many of them. And you'd think if there's not many of them, what would you want to have it specializing in? You would want to have one that always knows where you left your keys, or another one who could tell you whether Grover Cleveland was president before or after Benjamin Harrison. That was a trick question, by the way. And what are they doing instead? Instead of something useful like that, one of them is devoted to Jennifer Aniston. What this tells you is this world in which we take this deeply ingrained primate sociality of interest in, awareness of, investment, stakeholdering in the consequences of social relations, about individuals, other monkeys, other chimps, other humans who are real in your everyday life. And we have a part of the brain that's really set up to keep track of them. And before you know it, living as we do now, it's keeping track of the likes of Jennifer Aniston. So if you have devoted a ridiculous number of your neurons there to recognizing Taylor Swift or Jennifer Aniston or Ryan Gosling or whatever, that's fairly normal. You just have a primate brain.
Okay, finally, Jim from Oregon says, I have a 30-year-old autistic grandson. I also have at least one sibling that is on the spectrum, if consulting the current zeitgeist is correct. Now, we are being told by HHS that it is not genetic and they will find a toxic environmental trigger to be announced by September. Can you bring some light to the state of the science on this issue?
Yes. Okay. Autism, as implied by Jim's comment there, now termed autism spectrum disorder because there's a range from mild manifestations to extreme. And that is a judgment-free way of, rather than saying mild, to severe, disabling, whatever, because of the whole neurodivergence movement that's saying that mild cases of people being on the spectrum, this is not a disease. This is just another way of being a normal human. And there's much to be said for that. When you look at people who have the most extreme versions of autism, it is indeed severe and disabling. So, HHS says autism is not genetic. First off, HHS is the Department of Health and Human Services here in the United States. And as we now approach this issue of what do genes have to do with autism, what do external toxins have to do with it, we're going to consider two types of people. The first ones are people who are thinking in a reasonably informed, rational way about these issues. And the second group are the people who are functioning as goiterous 15th century peasants. Let's go for the more rational people first. So, the notion that genes have nothing to do with autism is simply wrong. You do all sorts of classical approaches in what is called behavior genetics. You look at patterns of autism within families. It runs in families. You look at twins, identical versus non-identical twins, another standard tool in that field. You look at people who are adopted. Do they share a trait more with their adoptive parent than with their biological parent? It's a whole school of approaches there. And what they show is there's a fair degree of heritability of autism. There's a fair genetic component to it, which in the business usually means 50, 60% of the variability is explained by the genes. So that doesn't sound like what HHS was saying. So if genes are involved, are there mutations that can cause autism? And a large number of mutations have been identified by now, and they tend to be involved with genes having to do with neural development, developing neurons, wiring up with each other. There's a family of those that have been identified that are statistically associated with autism. Another class of mutations, this is somewhat sort of mutation trivia fans. Another type of mutation is not that a gene is knocked out or it's misspelled, but rather a stretch of DNA is duplicated and stuck next to it. which may or may not have interesting consequences. These are called copy number variants. And people with autism tend to have higher than expected rates of having copy number variants in their genes. Okay, so genes, mutations, heritability, all of that. Why would not the Gordiverse peasants, why would rational, informed people reach a conclusion that genes don't really have much to do with autism? I would say for three reasons. Um, the first one is that you will see somebody who has autism and their parents don't have it. None of their ancestors did. And you would say, aha, mutations run in families. Here's this person. There's no family history of it. So it couldn't be a mutation. And what you see instead is a mutation that started with that person, what is called a de novo mutation. And it turns out a lot of people who have some sort of mutations associated with their autism have a de novo mutation. They're the first one and will now pass on to subsequent generations. Next is people who are oriented towards, ooh, there's a genetic basis of this disorder. There's a genetic contributor to what's mostly going on in their heads is, ooh, somewhere there's a gene that is responsible. And when you look at anything remotely interesting in terms of genetics and behavior, what you'll see instead is that these are all what's termed polygenic. And what the careful survey studies suggest is there's hundreds of genes that have been implicated. So, ooh, there's no smoking gun, and you can suddenly get it from out of nowhere. None of your family has it, and that's genetic. And the third problem is when people are saying genetic, they're usually having a feeling about what is called selectivity and specificity, that everyone who has this mutation has autism, that there's no one who has autism who doesn't have this mutation, and that there's no disease that you see in addition to autism that goes along with this mutation. And it turns out that's not the case because for a huge percentage of neurodevelopmental disorders, there's overlaps in the symptoms and the diagnostic. Okay, so that would lead lots of people to sort of feel like this is not slam dunk genetics. It's not the simple version of genetics that our great great grandparents were raised on. It's a complicated genetic picture, but there sure is a major genetic component. Okay, so what other components are there that would begin to account for it's not just genes, there's a substantial amount of variability explained by non-genetic factors. And are we heading in the direction of what HHS is telling us? Well, what are some of the factors? A lot of prenatal environmental factors, uh, pregnancy complications, birth complications, maternal smoking, a number of different types of prescription drugs associated with an increased diabetes, the mother during pregnancy exposed to certain types of particulate air pollution. That's one of the findings. Stress, sleep apnea, transient hypoxia during birth. All of these have been associated. None of them are big effects. None of them are slam dunks, but they're all starts of the pictures of troublesome prenatal and perinatal lives for both the mother and the fetus, increase the likelihood of autism. The exact same sort of undesirable events increase the risk of all sorts of other diseases. And you get people with autism who have none of those partial overlap. Okay, so what else do we know? How about parenting? Does parenting have something to do with autism? And the answer is no. And the more involved answer is no. And this is one of the tragic chapters of the last century science, which was one, a charmingly disastrous, poisonous, toxic metaphor that came along, I don't know, in the 1930s with the notion that autism was caused by mothers with lousy mothering, mothers who couldn't express warmth, were cold, were emotionally aloof and detached. And the metaphor was refrigerator mothers. And decades worth of mothers of kids with autism were told it's your fault because you can't love. It's your fault because you can't express emotions. And that was completely debunked scientifically. And along the way, there was one major villain in this, which was one of the famed intellectuals of psychiatry of the last century, Bruno Bettelheim. He was one of the most visible advocates for the refrigerator mothering causes autism. He wrote a number of bestsellers about this, The Empty Fortress, saying people with autism, there's nothing there. Bruno Bettelheim was a fraud and a monster. He faked his data. He faked his European academic credentials when he came to the US as a refugee. He was a sadistic bastard to autistic children who wound up in his program, to people under his mentorship who he was sort of leading along in their careers. And he persisted with this long after there was definitive proof that there was no such thing as a refrigerator mothering cause of autism. And he went to his grave refusing to apologize. A vile, monstrous person. And a really interesting study in he was not deceiving himself. He damn well knew what a fraud he was. Okay, so much for parenting. But what else? What else are suggestions? And now we get into, instead of 1930s inflammatory issues, we get into contemporary ones, which is the notion that vaccines can cause autism. In particular, the vaccines, the MMR vaccines, measles, mumps, rubella, can cause autism, that they are the leading cause of autism. In particular, it was this mercury stabilizer that used to be added to these vaccines, thimerosal, which was the thing that was supposedly doing this. And this puts Bruno Bettelheim to shame. All of this started in the 1990s with a paper published in the prestigious British medical journal, The Lancet, by a British surgeon named Andrew Wakefield. And what he reported was a data set showing that having gotten the MMR vaccine was the most important statistical predictor of autism and MMR vaccines in general, he eventually sort of wallowed into, that vaccines can cause autism. And this was landmark in every newspaper, and every parent of a child with autism, every parent considering vaccinating their child heard this. And it took about a decade for Wakefield to unravel. He faked his data. The paper was eventually retracted by the journal. Every co-author on the paper insisted in affidavits that they wanted their name off it. And perhaps most repellingly was Wakefield was being paid by law firms that were suing vaccine manufacturers and never bothered to disclose that to anyone. Wakefield came up for trial. He had his medical license taken away. He's some sort of snake oil salesman down in Texas now, I believe, most recently. And that was the trashing of the study that said vaccines cause autism. And in the years since, all sorts of people have supposedly shown the vaccine autism link. And you look closely, and every single one of them either has, you know, horrifically bad science or fraud, or at a very high rate, financial incentives for these people to be coming out in favor of law firms suing vaccine makers, being able to soon market test kits at home. Wakefield was all set to make millions with that. Every responsible scientist, every responsible medical association, pediatric, neurological, psychiatric associations, every one of them reviewing what is by now a very large literature showing that every time that careful science is done, showing there is no connection whatsoever between any vaccine out there, and in particular MMR, and risk of autism. They do not track historically. The mercury additive was taken out at one point, and that had no effect on the rates of it. There is no correlation. There is no science. It is something that has caused all sorts of people out there to not vaccinate their children. So this brings us to, instead of the people who are reasoning through, well, how much of a genetic effect do you need to have for you to say there's some genetic component, there's a substantial, there's an impressive. Now we get to the goiterous 15th century peasants. And the big problem is that they're running the Department of Health and Human Services since January 20th under the steerage, the captaining of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is a widely discredited pseudoscientist, conspiracy theorist who has been campaigning in favor of Wakefield's hypothesis for years, who will refuse to state that the paper was appropriately retracted. RFK Jr., who has had financial incentives for attacking vaccines with some of the advocacy groups that he has formed, and he is now running the Department of Health and Human Services, one of the most realpolitik moves of all time in terms of consequences. When he decided he wasn't running for president anymore, ooh, was he going to tell his followers to vote for Joe Biden or to vote for Trump? And he did a backdoor deal with Trump where Trump said, tell your supporters to vote for me. And what do you want to do? What do you want to be in charge of? And he said, Health and Human Services. And he's the person running it now. And every credible scientist doing biomedical research as part of Health and Human Services at NIH, at CDC, at any of them, every single respectable scientist has either been fired by now, has fled from the job, or is trying to run a resistance there of seeing if they can stay under the radar and get some of their science still done. And to my knowledge, not a single solid, credible scientist has signed up to be sort of a bootlicking whore for the sort of stuff that RFK is pushing now. They'd rather get fired. They'd rather leave. So at this point, pay no attention. Most of what HHS says about anything at this point is pseudoscientific lies. And much like the consequences of the current administration and what's going on in Ukraine, and much like the consequences of the current administration and what was done to USAID, and much like lots of other fronts, a lot of innocent people are going to die because of this. And this is what HHS is doing now by stopping vaccine production, spreading vaccine misinformation, and getting the rest of the country to begin to act like 15th century goiterous peasants.
And we are going to end episode 61 on that sobering note. Keep submitting questions at the form found in the Instagram story highlight and bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.